Shifts in power take time. Was the shift from a small city-state localized in the city of Rome to a massive sprawling empire? These transitions take time. The same can be said for transitions of the leadership of a nation from one man to another. According to Bradley and Sanger, in 2008, in Zimbabwe, in the lead up to the election and afterwards, there was massive violence. Hundreds of people died, and eventually a compromise was struck. Today we'll be focusing on a different kind of transition of power, the transition of the presidency of the United States between Election Day and the inauguration of a new president. Though transitions today may be peaceful in the United States, they were not always that way. Once upon a time, transitions could be the toughest time for our country, as we would see economic collapse and even civil war during those periods. The time between the election and the inauguration of a president-elect can be one of the most important times for the United States government. That time can set the tone for presidency or even introduce conflicts that reverberate throughout the president's term in office. It is because of the latter that there have been massive changes made to the transitional period for the United States of America. Today we'll be going over 4 different presidential transitions of power. The first transition we'll focus on today is transition between President Carter and President Reagan. Towards the end of Carter's presidency, he was dealing with the Iranian Hostage Crisis, in which many Americans were being held by the Iranian government. Now, Carter was working day and night to try and get the hostages released. And right as Reagan gets sworn into office, they finally released the American hostages. This was, of course, a cheap shot at President Carter by the Iranians, but it also set the tone for Reagan's presidency. Reagan's presidency was a great time for the U.S., and it involved a lot of compromise with the USSR and working together to de-escalate tensions from the Cold War. But he couldn't have done it alone. Just as the Iranian hostages weren't released really at all thanks to him, it was thanks to the leaders of Iran who decided to release the hostages. But similarly, the USSR decided to compromise with the United States on many issues and work to de-escalate tensions. And that was in many ways thanks to the leader of the USSR being willing to work with the United States and President Reagan. It's also thanks to President Reagan and his willingness to cooperate as well. Thanks to Reagan and Gorbachev, tensions de-escalated in the Cold War. Gorbachev's policies would eventually lead to the fall of the Berlin Wall and of the USSR. But Reagan worked with him to help de-escalate tensions in the meantime. Reagan got many things thanks to the willingness of other world leaders to work with him. And that is really represented by the fact that right as he took office, right during that transition of power, the Iranians decided to work with him and release the American hostages. Over 100 years before the Iranian government decided to release the American hostages, another crisis was brewing during the presidential transition period. This time, election fraud. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, there are accusations of election fraud by both sides in 3 states in the South. It couldn't go on like this. There were talks of another civil war brewing. But in the end, the 2 nominees, the Republican Hayes and the Democrat Tilden, made a deal. First, Tilden would concede the election. Hayes would become the president. Second, a Democrat would take a spot in the cabinet. I'm all for bipartisanship, so far I don't see any problem, but there was a third thing. Federal troops would be removed from the South. Ever since the end of the Civil War, federal troops have been occupying southern states to make sure that Reconstruction went on as planned, and more vitally, to ensure that African Americans were able to have their rights to vote, their rights to hold office. All these were ensured by those federal troops. But Hayes agreed to take them out of the South. This was huge for Hayes' presidency, and it really was a defining moment. He isn't remembered really for much else. During his presidency, Reconstruction ended, and that was the entire tone of his presidency, and that was all set right the day before he was even in office, when he agreed to that deal to remove federal troops from the South. That is what Hayes is remembered for. And African Americans, they never got to see the heights that they had experienced in the 1860s and 70s ever again until the 1960s. That one decision, the day before he was inaugurated, set the tone for Hayes' entire presidency and really for an entire era of American history for African Americans. Now, let's look at what happens when everything goes wrong for the United States during the presidential transition time. Probably the most famous and best example of a US presidential transition where everything went wrong is transition from President Buchanan to President Lincoln. We all know what happened under President Lincoln. The Civil War happened. Long, bloody, the bloodiest war, in fact, in American history. 600,000 people died. But what really caused the war? What was the lead up to it? That not so many people know. And really that lead up happened in that transitional period. During that transitional period, all these states in the dark blue in the South, they all left the Union. Buchanan was probably the most famous do-nothing president of all time. While these states all succeeded, he did very little to stop them or do anything about it, really. As those southern states were raiding arsenals, he sat by and did very little. After Lincoln took office, these 4 states all left the Union as well, with Virginia splitting into 2 over the issue. But Lincoln suspended habeas corpus and was able to get these 4 states, as well as West Virginia, to stick with the Union. And that was vital towards bringing the war to an end quicker than it could have been. Now, the question must be asked, what could Lincoln have done? Could he have stopped this? Frankly, I don't know, and nobody knows for sure either, but it's certainly very possible that he could have done a lot more. Perhaps he could have done a lot more to prepare for war. Perhaps he could have gotten those federal arsenals and fortresses in the South to really arm, and then he could have little Union islands within the South to help him win the war. Or maybe what could have been even worse. Maybe that would have inflamed the South even more, driving more people in the South to go to war with the Union. In the end, we won't ever know, but it certainly was a very turbulent time. 7 states seceded, while the President of the United States did nothing, and the President-elect, who ended up being one of the most active people ever to hold the presidency, was unable to do anything because he wasn't in office. This is easily the most famous transition of power in American history, as a do-nothing president left office and leaving everything in flames, and his predecessor spent the rest of his life, literally, trying to fix it. Another major transition is that from President Hoover to President Roosevelt from 1932 to 1933. Under President Hoover, the Great Depression started. By far the worst economic downturn in history had begun, and it just kept on getting worse and worse. According to Tugwell, nothing was getting done under Hoover. Hoover was doing almost nothing to try and solve the crisis. Finally, after 4 months after the election, Roosevelt finally took over. In his first 100 days, as my history teacher, Ms. Stafford, once said, it was like he passed the equivalent of 17 Affordable Care Acts. Now, many of those would later get struck down by the Supreme Court, but that much legislation getting passed, it's never been done before or since. And it was such a huge change, and it inspired confidence in people. That, combined with Roosevelt's fireside chats, gave them so much more confidence in the government that things began to turn around, and the Depression began to let up. But many do wonder, what could have happened if Roosevelt was able to take over, not in 4 months, but in significantly less time? Finally, that brings us to changes to the inauguration. Under President Roosevelt, the 20th Amendment was passed, according to L. Henry, and that amendment brought massive changes. Now, not only did the time between the election and the presidential inauguration get cut down to just 2.5 months, but it also eliminated lame duck Congresses that had members had been voted out almost a year and a half previously. Those massive changes helped a lot, especially considering that Roosevelt and before him Lincoln had to deal with presidents in office who had done nothing to deal with the conflicts that they would have to face. Now that time was cut down. The amount of damage that could be done was cut down by a significant amount. Thanks to the 20th Amendment, we have the inauguration that we see today, one that occurs in mid to late January, every 4 to 8. As you can see, the presidential transition can be one of the most important times for the United States of America. The presidency is a tradition-filled office. During the transitional period, both presidents act with great respect towards one another and their positions as leaders of the country. And traditions like that, they keep the United States together. Thank you for listening.